Carolyn is the executive director of the Science and Environmental Health Network. Her path to this work is really fascinating. She originally worked as an archaeologist in the desert southwest of the US, where she grew enchanted by the landscape but horrified by the environmental threats from mining, dams, and toxic waste. That desire to protect the environment, the rivers, the prairie, the desert, led her to law school. Her archaeology training and her law education provided her with the tools she needed to serve her clients, which were the future generations of all species. In 1998, Carolyn co-convened the seminal Wingspread Conference on the Precautionary Principle, and she has co-edited 2 books on the topic, Precautionary Tools for Reshaping Environmental Policy and Protecting Public Health and the Environment, Implementing the Precautionary Principle. Today, we will learn directly from one of the world's foremost experts on how we can move this principle from theory into action for a healthier future and how we can use it as a guide in uncertain times. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Carolyn Raffensperger. Carolyn, we're going to figure this out together.
Test, test, test. Let's see.
All right, and then if you have a pocket or a belt, you can slip that on.
Yeah, let's see. Does that work?
That sounds good.
All right. I wander, and I use my whole body to talk. Especially in bad lighting, my body and my voice will carry this, and you will hear better if you can see me. That's my basic premise in public speaking. So trying to attach this to me somehow, it's always a challenge. Don't wear a belt. All right. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start and I will end with a poem. And today's poem is Mary Oliver, Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. I think of public health as telling about our place in the family of things. And in fact, it's part of my definition of health. But what is health? Wendell Berry, the great writer, and I'll end with his poem, a poem that he writes and I think is applicable also to public health. He says that health is membership. So when we think about all the ways that we remove or separate people from either the land and the environment or from each other, all of those ways actually impact health. So those wild geese, that part of the environment up there migrating through, announcing our place in the family of things. The other definition is Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold says that the health of the land, and I think this is also applicable to public health and our individual health, is that it's the capacity of the land for self-renewal. So the ability of the organism, the human, the land, for self-renewal is Aldo Leopold's definition of health. So I want to tell you, how did I come to be where I am, standing in front of you and talking to you about the precautionary principle? It's because of a graduate student. So I was doing this work, putting together the Science and Environmental Health Network, which is the organization I work for. And it arose out of really the misuse of science in Washington, D.C. and public policy. And it was being misreported. So the science of things like dioxin, a major endocrine disruptor, was being described in the New York Times as safe as sunbathing. And I grew up when it was still safe to sunbathe. And so all these environmental groups came together in Washington, D.C. to talk about, how could we rethink how science was used in environmental policy. I went to a conference a lot like this that was on reproductive toxicants, so endocrine disruptors. And there was this graduate student sitting there, and he came up to me afterwards and said, "Would you do a collaborative dissertation with me?" I said, "Yeah." And he didn't tell me what it was on. So this very same day that I got a copy of his dissertation proposal, which was on this thing called the precautionary principle, I was invited to apply to be the director of something called the Johnson Foundation, which is in Racine, Wisconsin, and it hosts these conferences called Wingspread conferences. And it was at conferences like that that NPR began, at a Wingspread conference. There was National Endowment for the Arts was created at a Wingspread conference. And Theo Colborn had held a Wingspread conference to catalyze and coalesce the idea of endocrine disruption. So I got this idea called the precautionary principle, and I knew it was the answer to questions that my board had been asking me, which is, what's the alternative to risk assessment as a decision-making tool? And this idea comes across my transom. Wanted to do a collaborative dissertation on the precautionary principle. I said, that's the answer to that question. And I called up the Johnson Foundation that day and said, would you be interested in holding a conference on the precautionary principle at Wingspread? I said, oh, well, it takes 1.5 years, 2 years to, it was that kind of bureaucratic stuff that conference organizers know all the time, right? Unless you have some really wonderful facility like UNI. But I put together an organizing team, and within 6 months we had grants, and we had a commitment of Wingspread to hold the conference and to bring in international speakers. And it was out of that conference that Joel Tickner, the graduate student who had approached me, did his dissertation. And we published a book of collected papers, which I think is still pretty much the book of record on the precautionary principle. It was published by Island Press. And the major people in environmental health contributed papers to that particular book. I don't necessarily recommend you go out and get it. You got that one sentence about the definition of the precautionary principle, which, by the way, is not the complete Wingspread statement. The whole Wingspread statement is about a page long. It would behoove you to go read the whole thing. But what I would note about the precautionary principle definition that you read up there is that it is stated positively, in contrast to the Rio Declaration, which is stated negatively. So the Rio Declaration essentially says, well, scientific uncertainty and the likelihood of harm should not necessarily be used to block action. Like how to dither and give cover to opponents of the precautionary principle. And the Wingspread statement says, when you face scientific uncertainty and the likelihood of harm, you take precautionary action. It's stated affirmatively and positively. And I would suggest that that's the difference. And one of the reasons that there's been so much resistance to the precautionary principle on the part of the chemical industry and many others. But at its core are two big ideas that really change the terms of the debate. The first is that it is an ethical, it brings together ethics with epistemology. And it's that ethical underpinning, which I think is the bedrock of public health. So yeah, we use words like harm or other kind of words, but I would submit to you that the core idea of the precautionary principle and the root of public health is to prevent suffering. It's to prevent suffering. Every single time you hear of a cancer or a case of autism or a case of asthma, you know that this is actually a suffering index. What you are hearing is suffering. If you have a child, a 8-year-old who has a brain tumor, or you have a child born with a birth defect, that is a kind of suffering that we don't wish on anyone. And yet we argue them away and say, well, what's the cost-benefit analysis of cleaning up the water in Iowa? You're supposed to take your individual measures to protect against radon. But what are we doing as a state to clean up our water? What is our state doing when we look at the trends of cancer? So by the way, trends are really useful data in public health, really useful data. And so when you start watching those cancer trends go up, when you watch the cancer trends go up, especially in younger people, then you know something is up. And you use that data to prevent suffering. You look at ways to intervene and prevent suffering. That's at the core of the precautionary principle. And yes, there's another if-then part of that statement. If you have scientific uncertainty. We have a lot of scientific uncertainty about the causes of cancer in Iowa. Lots of uncertainty. And uncertainty is that part of that whole body of philosophy called epistemology. So these two branches of philosophy, ethics, and epistemology come together in the precautionary principle. Who knows? What do you know? What don't you know? What don't you know that you don't know? I'm not going to quote Donald Rumsfeld about the known unknowns and unknown unknowns, but you can go Google that whole quote and apply it to the epistemology underlying the precautionary principle. So I could have done a whole day conversation about scientific uncertainty, type 1 and type 2 errors, meaning false positives and false negatives. And you can imagine what, let's say the chemical industry or the agricultural industry favors in terms of the type of errors that they would prefer. They would prefer a lot of false negatives, right? If you're going to make a mistake, no, all of the nitrates in the water don't cause any problems, right? Whereas public policy can be driven by false positives. So if you get a positive reading for some really terrible virus, let's just say Legionnaires, if you've got a Legionnaires outbreak in Marshalltown, for instance, even if it's a false positive, you are going to test, right? Although it's hard to get a false positive when you've got sick people. You've got the positive already. But if you're testing the water and you find something in the water that don't have a direct nexus to disease, you will go back and do more testing. So a false positive drives more research, more work. We don't want any errors. We don't want a type 3 error where you ask the wrong question. You get the right answer to the wrong question, right? So lead is gluten-free. I'm here to tell you lead is gluten-free. You get the idea of what the wrong question is. So, the future is uncertain. The future is really uncertain. We're going to have a discontinuous future. So when we look at the future, we have a lot of tightly coupled systems. The economic system, we have climate change, we have possible food supply disruptions. We currently have a lot of chaos coming out of Washington, D.C. And did I hear a laugh from somebody disputing that there's any chaos out of Washington? The future is really uncertain. And the future of disease is going to be different than what we saw, say, from my generation. We are going to have changed patterns in both infectious and chronic disease. So if you look at infectious disease with the changes in how people are using vaccines, we are looking at new and rising zoonotic diseases. And some of this overlaps with the rise in chronic disease. So COVID looks like could also increase certain kinds of chronic disease burdens. The chronic diseases that we're seeing changes, patterns in over generations of my mother's generation versus my generation, and breast cancer or colon cancer in young people, these are all changing patterns of disease. And for a lot of these, the cause is separated in time from the effect, right? So my husband, who just died of cancer, was diagnosed with cancer quite a while ago, and it was probably no proof of causation here, but he was 15 when they began using pesticides on our farm in North Dakota, and he was using an open spray coop. They had no running water on the farm, and he is using an open spray coop to spray pesticides on an enormous farm. and then sleeping in the clothes that he had sprayed in, coming into the wind, drenched in pesticides. And he was diagnosed with a disease called Paget's disease, which is a disruption of calcium metabolism. And so like the bird shells from DDT, and that got really soft and couldn't spongy. So the vertebra in my husband's neck collapsed from Paget's disease. It affected his jaw and his teeth. And yet, this is probably an endocrine disruptor. Where would that have come from? And then he died of prostate cancer, and which had spread through most of the bones of his body, probably exacerbated by the Paget's disease. So what a mess he was. Is there any proof that it was the pesticides? No. No. Is it a likely scenario? Yes. If we saw those kinds of patterns, what will we be seeing in your generation when you are 70 or 65? He was diagnosed at 65. 3 days later, by the way, he took a job at Iowa State University, where he retired at 86. And I had negotiated, as this lawyer, I negotiated an early retirement package for him at 86. So I'm not kidding. This is actually true. But Fred, went on to become what was known as the father of organic agriculture, not because of his cancer, which didn't manifest until he was older, but because of what he saw do to the soil. And his whole farming and his philosophy really led him to think about what was the health of the soil. And as the health of the soil goes, so goes our health, was one of his premises. So ethics and epistemology, preventing suffering, how do we actually implement the precautionary principle? The first is you heed early warnings. Now, I talked about trends as data. So you start to monitor trends, and you put in place early warning systems. Now, public health has done a pretty good job of this. There is a registry for adverse vaccine reactions. You are supposed to report any adverse vaccine reactions so that we can actually look at what kinds of problems a vaccine might cause. If we started doing that kind of disease registry, well, we also have, for instance, pet cancer registries. Those little tiny creatures are good cats in the mine, canaries in the mine, to tell us what's happening with flame retardants in our sofas, or these other kinds of chemicals that we have injected into the environment. And by the way, the reason that the disease patterns are changing, the reason that you need to be paying attention to trends, is because with the rise of fossil fuel chemicals, with the rise of climate change and all of that, we have fundamentally changed the chemistry of our bodies and fundamentally changed the chemistry of the planet. So when you look at climate change and what we're doing to the ocean, acidifying the ocean, when you look at any number of other changes that we've wrought, the microplastics in the environment, we have fundamentally changed the chemistry of our bodies. And your responsibility in public health will, in part, be to bear a lot of sorrow. You'll need each other to stick together, to comfort each other when we are facing a world now that is so different. So you heed these early warnings. What do the pet cancer registries tell you? What does the information about the increase in lung cancer tell you? It might be telling you about radon. It might be telling you, we're not smoking as much, but what's happening out there in the environment. How do you look at those trends, and what do you do with them? Heed early warnings. When you start paying attention to those trends and the data that tells you something is wrong, clusters and trends, then you start to get a picture and can ask yourself, do we know enough to act? Do we have any idea of what might be causing these clusters or this trend? Do we have any idea? Can we start reducing the load of, say, airborne antibiotic resistance? There's a huge amount of antibiotic resistant manure that becomes airborne in Iowa when we're putting hog manure all over the fields this time of year. What's happening with antibiotic resistance in the state of Iowa? What have we looked at? Do you know? And so heeding early warnings is key. Setting goals. So if you know that we have a remarkable track record on increasing our cancer rates in Iowa, how do we begin to set goals for reducing those? And when we set goals, then we'll find a way to meet those goals. And so when the early warnings tell you you got a problem, then you start setting your goals. Department of Health and Human Services set decadal goals for things like obesity, to reduce smoking, and things like that. Could we do the same thing in Iowa? Set goals for public health in our state and elsewhere, our towns. And then we look for the alternatives to harmful activities. What alternatives do you have to the kind of agriculture that we have that is polluting our water, polluting our air? What are the alternatives? And how do we make those changes? And by the way, choose the best environmental alternative. So there's a law called the National Environmental Policy Act that calls for doing an environmental impact assessment, statements. And as part of that, they look at alternatives. So what's the alternative to building a road through the wilderness? What's the alternative? But there is no mandate in any state or Canada or at the federal level that uses a National Environmental Policy Act or NEPA process to choose the best environmental alternative. What's up with that? So if you've done all this work, you've identified better environmental alternatives, and then you don't choose it, you set it up on a shelf, it's like a wasted dissertation, like put it up there and ignore it. Choose the best environmental alternative. The other thing is we need to reverse the burden of proof. Who needs to prove what? In causation, so Bradford Hill came up with a whole list of how you prove causation in epidemiology. And so there's things like, does the cause happen before the effect? Some basic logical things. And parenthetically, they could actually argue that tobacco, there was no proof that tobacco caused lung cancer because they were missing one of Bradford Hill's criteria, which is biological causation. They didn't know how it caused lung cancer. And so that those executives could stand there hand over heart and say, smoking doesn't cause no proof that smoking doesn't cause, that causes lung cancer. And so at what point do we say a proponent of an activity has the responsibility to bear the burden of proof? So there are a couple of ways we reverse the burden of proof, meaning that the proponent of the activity needs to demonstrate it's not going to cause cumulative impacts. That's how both a Minnesota law based on our work passed a law, especially for environmental justice, that said in a community that already bears an unfair burden, more than its share, of toxic chemicals, that you have to prove, company, that you're not going to add to that. Cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts is one of those bedrock ideas in public health as well. And so not adding to the cumulative impact of a water pollution or whatever it might be is a way to reverse the burden of proof. The other is to require the polluter to pay. So to the extent that the public is paying for agricultural pollution in the state, we still then bear the burden of proof. We still bear the burden, not just of proof, but bear the burden, whereas the polluter should pay. Oh, in the Florida Constitution, the sugar growers are obligated to pay, polluter pay, for the water contamination in the state. That has not borne out. There's been a lot of court decisions for wiggle room because many states privilege, big industries like agriculture. And the final way that we implement the precautionary principle is something that we talked about as democracy, that affected players, the affected parties, should have a seat at the table. So a community that is facing widespread pollution, or they're looking at another permit for, let's say, a CO2 pipeline, which is one of the things I've been working on lately, putting carbon capture devices, meaning capture the CO2 on top of ethanol plants compress the CO2, and then ship it through pipelines that have to be cooled and under pressure to some place where they can use it for enhanced oil recovery, because CO2 acts as a solvent underground to get more oil out of the ground. Now, what could go wrong? I don't know about anybody who grew up on a farm, but we use CO2 to euthanize animals in confined animal feeding operations. It will immediately asphyxiate you if you're within the kill zone. And you won't know what hit you because you can't see it and it's odorless. So who should bear the burden of proof? And how do we make that decision about whether that should come to your community? Don't you think a community should have a voice in whether that goes by the nursing home or the church or, the American Legion Hall? Don't you think they should have a voice in it? So there's this idea that you must be aware of free, prior, and informed consent. And free, prior, and informed consent means that, first of all, we're respecting the dignity of your autonomy, both as a community and as an individual, when we require free, prior, and informed consent. If you're doing public health experiments at this university or at a University of Iowa, you have to go before a review board to make sure that your experiment is ethical. And yet many of the activities that we are now putting forward into communities, CO2 pipelines, are not run as if they're an experiment, but they are. We do not know the outcome. And if it was done as an experiment at this university, how different the protocol and the ethical questions would be. Why don't we make corporations submit to the same ethical obligations that you do at the university if you're going to run an experiment? Animals in the labs here have more rights than a community has. Rights to have their health and their care seen to. And so the free, prior, and informed consent has been granted to communities, particularly indigenous communities, through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I would assert that it is a right that communities should have before activities that contribute to the polluted environment, to the possible degradation of health of either the land or the people, since those are connected. And so how would we go about that? I think public health has a lot of experience in that, with community-based research and participatory research and citizen panels where you look at whether this economic boom is worth taking the risk, but it's decided by the community. It's not some permit in Des Moines that's given to a major confined animal feeding operation where the local control has been taken away. So how do we turn back that free, prior, and informed consent? And I want to say that the informed part is critical. But what if we saw government agencies' responsibility to gather accurate information, including the uncertainties, and to give to the communities to make their decision to grant consent? We have lots of ways of giving consent: voting, referendums. There are endless ways. And there are endless ways of saying, and if you are wrong, oh corporation, we're going to make you post a bond. So if you are wrong, we do not bear the financial burden. Well, there are lots of ways of putting this together so that we protect public health, so we are still able to do some economic activity when we've got the consent of the community, and we still have backup if those corporations are wrong. And then the responsibility of agencies and universities is to provide that information. It's free, it's prior, it's informed consent. And it bribing communities, with another, we're gonna pay for another traffic light or a community center. It may or may not be a good bargain, but how the community makes those decisions should be up to the community. So, we're facing really complicated times coming up. And you will have careers that will emerge that will surprise you. A lot of you don't know what you will be doing, in the future. We don't know the future of federal or state funding. We don't know how this is going to play out. But what I want to say is that to the extent that you have chosen public health, that you have chosen an ethical career out of some place in your own soul that says, my calling, my sense of why I am in this earth, on this earth, is to prevent suffering, then you follow that moral compass. So, I think of Václav Havel, who talked about hope. And he said, hope is an optimism. I don't have a lot of optimism about how this all is going to play out. What the disease loads will be like. I'm old. I think I'm the oldest person in the room. What will my older age look like? I don't know. It's uncertain. And your futures are even more uncertain. And so, not optimism, but what Václav Havel said is hope is the deep orientation of the soul towards what is right. Towards what is right. And so we stay with that. We stay, our job, my calling is to prevent suffering. And I have some ideas about how to do it. Each one of you has a unique fingerprint of the divine on you, your own unique skills. You are one of a kind, never before seen in all of history or time. And you are here at this time with this community of people that share at least some of your hopes and dreams and desires and goals of making a better world, healthier soil, healthy babies that can come into the world that are not pre-polluted because the microplastics cross the placenta. And so it's that orientation. And I also want to say it's a lot more fun to work in a community with others that are also committed to this kind of calling and belonging to a healthy and whole world. And so I want to close with Wendell Berry's poem and listen for the phrases that are truly public health. I'll give you one clue. This one line in the middle, which I'll repeat, but I'm going to start with this. Ask yourself, as a public health expert, ask yourself, will this satisfy a woman satisfied to bear a child? Will this satisfy a woman satisfied to bear a child? We know that populations are declining in lots of states like Japan, countries like Japan, because women are not satisfied to bear a child. And when you look at what kinds of suffering we are seeing in small children, mental health problems in teenagers, what are mothers thinking about when they're willing to have a child? And how do we stand with them? So listen for those kinds of lines in this particular poem. It's called Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front, a good title for Iowa. Love the quick profit, the annual raise, vacation with pay, want more of everything ready-made, be afraid to know your neighbors and to die. And you'll have a window in your head. Not even your future will be a mystery anymore. Your mind will be punched in a card and shut away in a little drawer. When they want you to buy something, they'll call you. When they want you to die for profit, they'll let you know. So friends, every day, do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing, take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance for what man has not encountered, he has not destroyed. Ask the questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant, that you will not live to harvest. Say that the leaves are harvested when they have rotted into the mold. Call that profit. Prophesy such returns. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years. Listen to carrion. Put your ear close and hear the faint chattering of the songs that are to come. Expect the end of the world. Laugh. Laughter is immeasurable. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. So long as women do not go cheap for power, please women more than men. Ask yourself, will this satisfy a woman satisfied to bear a child? Will this disturb the sleep of a woman near to giving birth? Go with your love to the fields. Lie easy in the shade. Rest your head in her lap, swear allegiance to what is nighest your thoughts. As soon as the generals and the politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as a sign to mark the false trail, the way you did not go. Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection. And so I stand with you as you look to prevent suffering. It is my life's call. And for the rest of my life, I choose to dedicate it to protecting water. I was the first lawyer at Standing Rock, where the big resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline was there. I started the legal collective to protect the water defenders there. And just as an aside, I didn't expect that as a lawyer, to have $37,000 of cash strapped to my body so I could bail out water protectors. But I've dedicated myself to water, and I've dedicated myself to future generations. And I've also dedicated myself to night. Night is a habitat that we are destroying. We need night for sleep. Well, the creatures of owls and the moths and the bats and the trees need night for their very being, as do I. And so I stand with you as we work together. And as you find your calling going forward in this world, how that fingerprint of the divine that is only you brings those unique skills, the things that only you can do to bear on the problems that you have seen merit the gifts and skills that you bring to the world. Thank you so much for what you will do and for who you are now. I appreciate, and I look forward when I am 90 to hearing from you and having you say, I once heard you, and I want you to know what I've done on behalf of the earth. And I would charge you not only with preventing suffering and bearing that sorrow, but finding joy where you can. Be joyful that you have considered all the facts. Thank you.
Holy cow, Carolyn. That was amazing. I'm only up here because I need the microphone because I don't think I can orate as well as you, but we now have plenty of time for Q&A, discussion. I feel like we should really digest this together, your remarks. I have sort of just to kick things off while you all are sort of formulating your thoughts. I want to give the room a little bit more of a glimpse into what you're working on at the Science and Environmental Health Network. If you could describe some of the issues that you're working on.
Yeah, so my policy is to only work with people who are smarter than me, which, so I have these astonishing fellow colleagues at the Science and Environmental Health Network. Two people that you may know, Sandra Steingraber, who is renowned for her writing. She wrote a book called Living Downstream, an Ecologist Looks at Cancer. And she was in a family in Illinois, near where my grandparents lived. And she got bladder cancer. And her aunt had the same bladder cancer, lived in the same area. And she knows that bladder cancer runs in families. The only thing is she was adopted. Yeah. And so she writes about the environmental pollution and what she uncovered about the environmental nexus between her cancer and what was going on out in the land. She's now taken up and been working on fracking. She got the fracking ban in New York, and just testified before the Mexican Congress about not starting to frack Mexico because of the dispute between this administration and Mexico. And Pemex is a nationalized oil industry, and they're looking at what they need to do. So they're at a cusp on whether they will frack or not. So she's an expert around the world in the public health issues associated with fracking and essentially the oil and gas industries. So one of the things that we are doing is tackling CO2, carbon capture and storage, and CO2 pipelines. I've been coordinating working groups on CO2 pipelines, on the tax structure. So we outsourced climate policy to tax policy by giving tax credits to people who collected the CO2, didn't stop polluting, they just start collecting the CO2. And we're giving them tax credits, which are secret, and doing a lot of work on that. We have a doctor named Ted Schuttler, who's really looked at a whole host of environmental factors that contribute to neurodegeneration, neurodevelopmental problems, breast cancer. He wrote a number of books, one called Generations at Risk, one called Environmental Threats to Healthy Aging, which was released on the Today Show. By the way, that report suggests that Parkinson's is actually preventable. We have pretty good information about chemicals and how they're linked to Parkinson's. So he's written a lot about that and continues to be an expert that advises communities. One of the things we do is when a community has a question, so East Palestine and the train accident that happened there, Ted went in to talk about what kind of testing needed to happen. He reviewed the tests and helped the community make decisions about how to go forward. The Lanai fire in Hawaii, and he was brought in by the city council to advise about rebuilding, what they needed to do to protect themselves from all the chemicals that had been released by the fire, et cetera. So we do a lot of work with communities. As a lawyer, I go in and help communities think through their options. I talk to a lot of state agencies. But one of the things you're going to find, go to work for a state agency. I was going in, and they would have on their wall these statements that their job was to balance competing interests. You know what that meant? That the oil and gas was an interest, and children's brains were another interest. And so the oil industry would have the oil, the company, they'd have the workers, all on one side, and then these poor children, the cancer, people trying to prevent cancer in children, was just a competing interest. And when you look at a lot of constitutions, like the Pennsylvania Constitution, this is one where I saw that for sure, and they saw that their job was to make everybody unhappy. So if they thought the oil industry and the environmentalists were unhappy, then they had done a good job. And to suggest, no, your job is not to balance competing interests. Your job is to protect public health and the environment. And they would be so surprised. And I would say, your role is a trustee, a public trustee of the commons. Public health is a commons. And so if you're protecting public health and the environment, that is a heroic and big job. Your job isn't to make everybody unhappy. Your job is to protect public health and the environment and prevent suffering. And they would cry. They would weep because nobody had ever told them that. Oh. And they should use the precautionary principle.
Great answer. Thank you. Thank you. Questions? Let's open it up.
We also have a newsletter. So if you go to www.sehn.org, you can subscribe to our newsletter. I just wrote an essay on what a morally mature culture looks like. And I talk about public health. So I had taken that phrase from an Episcopal priest who used to be in Cedar Falls named Ben Webb. And he wrote about this time in the Episcopal Church, which is that it required a moral maturity because they were reading the prophets of the Bible. And the prophets are the ones who speak for, with God's voice. They're the ones who are saying, you're doing something wrong. You need to fix this. And in fact, by the way, the difference between a prophetic voice and an angelic voice is the prophetic voice says, fear, turn the other way. And the angelic voice says, fear not, turn the other way. And I think public health is both. So you better be afraid, and you better change your course. And fear not. We stand with you. Go the other way. Turn the other way. Protect water. Protect the air. But he wrote about this, and what I say is that I think public health workers are now our prophetic voice in our culture. The ones who are calling for clean water in this state, you're going to hear from David, those are the prophetic voices now that are saying you have an obligation to change your ways. Better fear, because you're going to get worse if you don't, and turn the other way.
I think
That's my essay in the last newsletter if you want to read it.
That's such an amazing lineup for our first two speakers, the angelic voice followed by the prophetic voice. I think it's so good. Okay, questions?
Can you give some thoughts on best practices for work, over your career, like working through challenges and all the challenges that we're facing, whether it's, withdrawal of resources and misinformation. So, yeah, over the course of your career, what have you seen as being the most effective ways to kind of combat those challenges?
My advice is to work in community, to have people that know who you are, to spur good ideas. So I'll tell you what I do, and my unique gift, and that is to see a little ahead of what the environmental movement's going to need. And so, over my career, I've just been a little step ahead. And then, but it was other people. It was Joel Tickner, that graduate student, that came and said, I know what to do with that idea. I'm surrounded with people that I dearly love. So do I think carbon capture and storage is the biggest problem in the world? No. But I do think the community is what's going to get me through these very dark times. And the other thing is, what worked for me is not going to work for you all. And the reason is, right now, I think nonprofits are the place to go. Government jobs are under duress, as you well know. I mean, what's happened to CDC? Look what's happened. I think that the universities are increasingly challenged to be an honest broker for public health. If you go up against industry, we can tell you story after story. My husband got fired from the Leopold Center because he challenged the hog industry. And he was fired in the form of a promotion, which was why I could negotiate an early retirement package when he was 86, because he was promoted into this position where they thought he could be harmless. He was a distinguished fellow at the Leopold Center. But I think it's community. And then I think the locus of good ideas and good work is going to be nonprofits. And I think that we still have more freedom than others to act. And the nonprofit world, the large ones, Greenpeace, in trouble, no question about it. Little organizations like mine are a little bit freer, although we're seeing, like the IRS is weaponized. Another organization over in Illinois that I work very closely with is having its 501c3 challenged. And so, and I think funding is going to be complicated. Nevertheless, I think if you have options, look to nonprofits, form community with other people, stay in touch with people, and don't fall for the usual internal squabbles. I think that one of the things I've seen in the last year is that a lot of environmental and public health groups have come together and bridged some of their old differences. And I think that, so those are my advice. You're gonna be navigating really uncertain waters. And I think you're gonna have to hold on to that compass and look for fellow travelers, and look for people that will know what you're going through, that can bring the casserole when things fall apart, because they will. And I think that what I look for is to be surprised at what emerges out of this time. As people get sicker, as the old diseases reemerge, I think we're going to see more local control over public health measures, and that could be really interesting. Godspeed.
I'm curious about how your nonprofit works. So I'm just doing it for the website. With video folks from West Coast, are you based in the West?
I'm in Iowa.
So how do you go about determining
Yeah. So we sort of take on the emerging issues that are environmental health. And if it's fossil fuel related and got a public health angle, we're on it. Especially if asked to do it. We are a virtual organization. We don't have a building. And as I said, I hire people that are smarter than I am. And so Ted Shetler was a doctor getting his MPH from Harvard when I called him up. And I called him up and said, hi, I'm a North Dakota farm wife. Would you like to do some work on something, looking at cumulative impacts of toxics? So the question was persistence. So some chemicals are persistent in the environment. They just last a long time and don't degrade. But some are so frequently used that they are persistent by the frequency of their use. And I asked him to write a paper on it for the Environmental Defense Fund. He said, sure. But he wasn't moving from Boston. And so we started this virtual organization where I lived in North Dakota, he lived in Boston, and now Sandra lives in New York. Our administrative person lives in Eugene, Oregon. Ted now lives in Bolinas, California. So we have a distinguished fellow who lives in New Jersey. Carmi Orenstein is an occupational and safety worker, and she lives in New York. Yeah.
We're so lucky that you're close, Carolyn.
I do want to follow up and ask, do any of you have ideas about how you think you're going to navigate the future? What will build resilience into your own life and into the field of public health? Do you have any thoughts on that? Did anything I say trigger an idea, initiate an idea?
Sure. I think what helps me is thinking locally, when the news we get is so much federal information, our newspapers are dying, we don't watch local news anymore, so a lot of people are just like disconnected from what's local, and then they get so disparaged thinking about all the federal news that's negative. But what has helped me is trying to get really involved in figuring out where the local change is happening. So like with our role at CEEE, we work with farmers right here. I'm on like the Waterloo Clean Streets Committee, so we're working on bicycle and pedestrian access in Waterloo. And so it's just been and that's where you can, like you said, change kind of starts to happen locally. And if you're not involved in those local things where change can happen, it's so easy to get really, really frustrated. Just find a way, a place to volunteer, a board to join, figure out who are the influencers in the community, and even if I like joined Complete Streets because I was like, why is there so much glass on the sidewalks? Like, I can't bike anywhere. And then I learned about, the cost of things and the barriers, and it is not fast to make change, but at least now I know the people who make a change, and I'm learning about the policies and product change.
So Renee Dubose, who was a sociologist, said, every civilization creates the conditions for its own diseases. And what it sounds like to me is that you are creating some of the conditions for health. And that's a whole different approach, and really the bedrock of public health. And so doing it locally is a place to start. Not so much glass on the sidewalk. Kids can play. You can ride your bike. Increases the cardiovascular health of your community, the well-being all the way around. So I would submit to you that Renee Dubose' quote also applies to injustices. So every time you have a disease, look for the injustice behind it. And if you address the disease, you probably are also addressing an injustice. Other questions?
Question. So, kind of very similar to the challenges and kind of the means to overcome them. I keep thinking about like a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset, and some of the things that we're dealing with as far as funding loss and sort of these resources and just the different things that are becoming harder to capture. And I feel like at our center, I'm the director of the CEEE and just continuing to promote like this abundance mindset. So I would just love to hear from you where you feel like we can balance all of that, the ability to kind of work together and still feel connected to that there is enough for all of us, but also the realities of what a lot of us are facing in our work too. So I just love your perspective on kind of how we navigate these resources.
I think personal practices of gratitude and personal activities. So one of the things I do is buy a lot of yarn because I knit. I'm watching you knit in a beautiful color. I have a synesthesia with color, and it's very verbal for me. And so I knit, and I have a lot of yarn because I buy it everywhere. You know, silk, wool, cotton. You know, and I have a huge basket on my. And that's not even all of it. You know, it's like, and I play with the colors. I used to carve spoons. And do things like that because there's always enough wood to carve a spoon. But I think it's the practices of gratitude and being abundance for someone else. So my motto is the best defense against hard times is a well-fed neighbor. And I think you have a man who cannot feed his children. Let me tell you about danger. If you cannot feed your child or cannot provide diapers, so, by the way, public health indicators, so how many pregnant women have been evicted is a public health measure. You know what's going to happen to that baby and that mama? Trouble. How much infant formula has been shoplifted? As soon as you start looking at indicators like that, then you have an idea of where you're going to have big trouble. And so being abundance for other people, I think, is as much to provide what you can. So those of you who garden, I don't know, zucchini is probably my model for, like, maybe it's not zucchini, maybe it's sweet potatoes. In part because we were having a conversation about poverty and food waste before this started. And I grow sweet potatoes, and every time I do, I eat the greens. And I think about the famine foods that, for instance, Japan used sweet potatoes because you got calories. You could grow them, you could eat the greens, you could eat the tubers. And so it was quite, and they ate enough to turn their skin yellow. So vitamin A will do that. But I think it's to be abundance. And, I think the great thing about the earth is that it is still providing abundance for us. As badly as we've treated it, it's still gave me sweet potatoes this year. My garden was terrible. My husband was in hospice. And so and I ate a lot of dandelion greens because that's what was in my garden. I don't pull dandelions because I eat them. But be abundant. And the best defense against hard times is a well-fed neighbor.
That's beautiful. We have time for one more question. One more question.
Did I talk 40 minutes?
Pretty close.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
pretty close.
Any other questions?
Just any advice that you can share about working within the state. You're addressing clean water. I work in local government. Our control continues to slip away. We're limited in what we can do. And so I'm just curious, how do you keep at it without becoming just disgruntled or giving up?
I think it's that orientation of my soul, and that the alternative is to let it fall apart. And the other thing is, it's really more fun to work with other people, isn't it? I mean, if you just imagine who the most fun person is in your professional life, school life or professional life. Who is that fun person? You want to be around that person. I think it's that keeps going. It is that I don't have a choice in what I do. I've made my commitment to future generations. That is unwavering. And I don't care what anybody else is doing. You know, I may make mistakes, and I get pissed off, and I'm awake a lot at 3 in the morning. Just call me at 3 in the morning because I'm lying there going, what? Yeah. And I think the other thing is to know that each one of you has a personal life with your own sorrows and your own joys. And I don't keep mine very separate. My organization was fully aware of my husband's dying. And not to be maudlin about it, I didn't, you know, but they were very supportive of the fact that you have a personal life, that you will have your own mental health challenges. You're going to have breakups in your romantic relationships. You're going to, you know, lose a parent. It's and to be gentle with yourself. The other thing is, I'm so happy I'm going through what I'm going through older, because when I was 30, first of all, I was hell on wheels. You know, like mouthy. I thought I was right about most things. And now I'm aware, this too shall pass. This too shall pass. And no matter how pissed I am, I know this too shall pass. And I also have much more grace. I hope to live by grace. And not a religious grace, but that secular grace where I don't know whether my little grain of sand is going to make one hell of a bit of difference, but my little grain of sand may set off an avalanche. Just like Joel sending me a dissertation proposal has changed the world. So be gentle with yourself and not know the outcome is uncertain. But to the extent that we are good to each other, kind to ourselves, that we practice gratitude, that we be abundance, then I think, first of all, we've increased our own mental health and we've increased the public health of those around us. So.
Perfect. I think that was a beautiful way to end this part of our day. Thank you so much. Let's give Carolyn another round of applause. Thank you so much.